I'm with Mike Loginov, who you may know as the CEO of Ascot Barclay, but we are here to talk about his new book, CISO Defenders of the Cyber Realm, which some people are calling the best cybersecurity book written in the last decade. Mike, what is the book really about?
Well, thank you for that introduction, Karla. And yeah, it's really a book about Chief Information Security Officers. It's not so much for CISOs, but it's really for others, executives and the general public, to understand what it is we as CISOs do in helping to keep organisations and indeed society safe. So, it's not a technical book by any means. It really is more of a human interest story in terms of understanding who we are and what we do.
Now, one of the pieces of feedback I get quite often is that boards don't necessarily know what they should be asking from their CISO. So do you think the book would help them address that challenge?
Yeah, that was definitely one of the areas of focus. There's two parts to that. Number one is understanding what we called the CISO fingerprint, and what is it CISOs do? What are the competency sets that somebody like myself is asked to cover when I go into an organisation to help protect them? And as part of the research, we created what we call the mind map, really looking at all the competency sets. And it started to grow and grow and grow and grow. So it grew into quite a big list, really. So it's not like trying to hire a CFO or even a CTO. Mm-hmm. The CISO role is much grayer still, even after the few years that we've been out there. So as part of this, I interviewed, for example, the very first CISO, Steve Katz from Citibank, and it kind of all started with him. So we looked at the skills of the CISO, the competencies of the CISO. Then the second part of that really is the organisation and what is it we're being asked to defend. So what's the maturity of the organisation? Are we looking for a technical CISO, a strategic CISO, an operational CISO? So there was 4 key styles that we really identified within the research, and yeah, you'll find it all in the book in detail.
And do you cover in there around what a CISO should expect to be doing? What does their day look like? What does a month look like for them?
Yeah, we interviewed a good number of CISOs who are featured in the book. So there's direct interviews, much like this, sitting down and just having those conversations. But we also interviewed others, victims of cybercrime. So one particular chap, we went into detail as to what it was like to be the victim of identity theft. So, a database was hacked or some other means of getting his information, and how he recovered from that scenario. And it was quite insightful, really, to feel the pain of somebody who has been subject to identity theft and the impact on his family and his finances and that side of things. But we also interviewed, or I interviewed in quite some detail, some hackers, some guys who are doing this nefarious type of breach. One particular chap I interviewed, disguised voice. I've got no idea who he was, so through my network I managed to find somebody who was prepared to speak to me and talk to me about what sort of tactics and tricks they were doing and why they were doing it. But I was equally interested in how they felt about doing that, and stealing somebody else's information and data. And again, I go into that in quite some detail in the interview, and so there's some insightful stuff there.
Now, I know one of the things you cover is, does a CISO feel personally responsible when there's a breach? And what came out of your interviews from that?
Yeah, that was one of the questions that I asked a good number of CISOs. It was really just, if you had a significant cybersecurity breach on your watch, would you feel personally responsible for the breach? I'm ex-military, so I kind of think, well, I take responsibility, of course. That's kind of the way I've been brought up. But I think, speaking to many CISOs, and indeed in my own experience, the answer was a little bit surprising to start with, but then thinking about it more deeply, I can understand why most CISOs said no. They didn't feel particularly, or they wouldn't feel particularly responsible. And that was really as a result of the understanding that I as a CISO don't own the risk. The business owns the risk. The business owns the data. So I'm pretty much quite often in an advisory capacity saying to the business, look, we need to put this defense in, that defense in, improve this process, that policy, whatever it might be. But whether I get the funding to do that, whether I get the resources to do that, is usually somebody else making those decisions. So depending on how much I get, I guess one could argue depends on how strong an argument I put forward. But equally, it's also dependent on the culture of the organisation and how seriously they take cybersecurity. And there's still many organisations out there who are not taking cybersecurity as seriously as they need to. So, I can understand why a lot of CISO were saying they wouldn't feel personally responsible.
I think that's really interesting. And obviously the end victim is the person who has their identity stolen, but the company is also a victim of a breach. They didn't do that themselves.
Oh, indeed. And, companies have a high degree of exposure these days, as we know, not just from hackers, but if you do unfortunately suffer a breach, and most companies are realizing that it's not a case of if but when, if they haven't already been breached and don't know it. Mm-hmm. So there's that kind of aspect to it. But then you've got pain upon pain, because you then have the regulator coming in looking to evaluate and audit why the thing happened in the first place. And indeed, with GDPR and privacy rules, we have to report those breaches within certain timescales. So, that could lead, again, to even bigger fines. But what I do find is that sometimes the best companies to work for are those that have had a breach. Mm-hmm. Makes my life very much easier as a CISO, yes. Because when I go in there, if they have experienced the pain, it's definitely much easier to get the funding and the tools and the resources to, recover. I wouldn't advocate that's a good approach to go, by the way. It's definitely much cheaper and much less painful to mitigate mm-hmm. than it is to recover.
Now, you did just say that you feel some companies don't take it seriously enough. Do you think GDPR has helped with that, or do you think people saw that as a compliance exercise that has now been taken care of?
A bit of both. And again, it's back to organisational culture. I think GDPR has had more of a positive effect on cybersecurity than a negative one. I think I'm finding more and more in risk registers these days, when I'm looking at corporate risk registers, that it's not just an operational impact, a cyber breach, but it's a legal compliance one as well. And I quite often find with organisations that the boards have a low risk appetite when it comes to things that are related to compliance and legal aspects. So it's helped from that perspective for sure. But I think it's still early days. I think we've still got to see how the Information Commissioner Office, the ICO, is going to impose fines and how that'll all play out really in time.
Now, with all the CISOs that you've interviewed, if there's somebody who thinks that that's a role they want for their future, was there an obvious career path?
It was a great question. Well, one of the things that I tried to do in the book is just to, highlight what it is like to be a CISO. And we are, without doubt, a very, I don't want to say the word unique, but we're definitely I will say unique crowd in terms of who we are, what we do, and why we do it. And we do it for different reasons. But most of the guys I speak to, do it because they get a real buzz and enjoy, being in that position. And it definitely comes with a lot of certainly accountability. Whether we've got responsibility or not, that's questionable. But it's a really exciting role to get into if anybody is interested in getting into it. I guess when I speak at events, and indeed in the book, I would probably try and put people off doing it. And if after that they still think that they might want to do it, then they may have half a chance of getting into it. So, there's not that many of us. It's typically one per organisation. I know some have more, but it's usually one per organisation. So it's quite a competitive environment to get into.
It is, yeah.
But again, as I say, I think the market's starting to divide a little bit in terms of the different types of CISOs as well, and I think there's a recognition of that coming to bear as well. Traditionally, we've come from very technical backgrounds. Now we're starting to come more from a business perspective and a risk perspective, and I think that's changing the dynamic of the CISO role quite a bit as well. So, it's different types of CISOs, and then of course there are different routes as well. You can come into the industry and go down an academic route. I did quite a lot of work with various universities. I was involved with launching the National MBA in cybersecurity with Coventry University. I've been doing some work with Cranfield on security in the operational technology world. So that's another really fascinating area now, that looking at a wider threat landscape than purely information and data. We're now looking more at things like critical environments, building management systems, HVAC, power supplies, all of that sort of ecosystem that's needed to keep an organisation functioning, and how that can be attacked as well.
And as you look forward to the next 12 months, what do you think that will bring for the security industry and the challenges that CISOs face?
Probably a lot more breaches. We continue to get breached. Even although we're spending a lot of money on technology, we continue to do. We haven't found a silver bullet. The adversaries continue to get better at what they do. They get sharper. They've got money to spend. They're generally not paying taxes. They don't have to contend with some of the constraints that we do on the legal side. So it is a cat and mouse game. Sometimes we're ahead, sometimes they're ahead. So the thing is, we never really know. There could be another WannaCry around the corner, or some other type of attack or malware. We're obviously starting to see things like the growth of Bitcoin and that side of things as well continuing. Where that goes, we have to wait and see. So I see more attacks, and the need for CISOs to continue to develop their own skills. That's a never-ending challenge. We've got artificial intelligence on the horizon. We've even got software that heals itself. So at some point, do we cross the divide? And I've spoken to CTOs, for example, specialists in artificial intelligence, who would say that in the next few years we won't have any human software programmers. We won't need them, because the machines will do it for us. So where that all leads remains to be seen. And then we've got all the ethical aspects that we need to consider in that space. So I wish I knew is I guess the bottom answer. Yeah, it's like crystal ball world.
It is a little bit, and then at least maybe you could be ahead for a change.
That would be nice.
Yes.
Yeah, that would be nice. Absolutely. I think sometimes we are, sometimes we're not. So it's definitely a cat and mouse game, and we've got to continue to strive to be ahead of the game. Work with the community, develop the community, so that we are communicating as well as the bad guys are.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for speaking with me this evening, and good luck with the book.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you.